Excellent. Welcome to everybody to our inaugural RailTALK blog. We've been very excited to start this new content program and very happy to invite and to welcome Lauren Taylor from defendyourself.org and safebars.org to help us have what I think is probably one of the most important conversations in the industry in the last 10 years. The focus, as we've all seen over the course of the last, let's say, 18 months, on the treatment of the vulnerable in our restaurants, certainly specifically the way women have been treated, and classically over the time that the restaurant industry has been around, has caused a lot of strife and discomfort and pain to people who really just want to be able to work in our industry and enjoy the experience, the opportunity, the social side, all of it. So we as operators have a responsibility to address the way we protect and respect and care for the people that work for us. And so Lauren and her organization is a wonderful resource. I'm actually going to step back right now and ask Lauren to just take a second and talk about the advocacy and the programs that you folks are running that will help elevate this discussion and our addressing of issues surrounding harassment and assault. So please, Lauren, tell us about the organization, yourself, whatever you think will get us rolling.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and thank you so much for inviting me to your inaugural vlog. I'm very honored. So we see a bunch of problems and we are just going after different ways of addressing them. Our approach is pretty much training and empowerment. And the two organizations deal with two different roles that are in any harassment situation. Safe Bars trains people who work in bars, clubs, and restaurants with bystander intervention skills so that when you see something problematic, when you see harassment, when you see something that looks like it's getting worse, you will have the skills to step up and intervene. And I do want to say that we don't come in and kind of wave our fingers in the air and tell people what to do. We know that there's an incredible amount of wisdom in the industry in this area already, that people are stepping up often, and we just like to see where people are at and then raise their game.
Excellent.
And what Defend Yourself does is it empowers the people who are targeted. So Safe Bars empowers the people who happen to see something, and as people who work in bars, clubs, and restaurants, you all, your audience, you all are in a perfect position to intervene. And research does show that people who work in a venue can make a huge difference in the culture of that venue and what behavior is tolerated. And then what Defend Yourself does is it empowers the person being targeted to stand up on their own behalf.
That's really, to be honest, I didn't understand that until you just described it. And I think it's fascinating. It sort of leads to my next question is, and the place I really would like to start is, what are you hearing with your work, especially with Defend Yourself being advocacy for those who are the vulnerable? Mm-hmm. What are you hearing about? Is there a shift happening? Are we still in the same spot? What do we have to do? What do we have to listen to get sort of this conversation to move forward as quickly as we can?
I think, and I'm someone who's worked in the movement to stop what we used to call violence against women, but now we call it gender-based violence, because we know that people can be targeted no matter what gender they are, and in particular that LGBTQ people are often targets. I've been in this movement for 40 years, and I think that we are seeing a shift now with the whole Me Too moment, and I think it's going to be more than a moment. I think we've crossed some bridge as far as people who have been targeted, primarily women, taking the leap to tell their stories and share them publicly and shuck off some of the shame and victim blaming and guilt and the what I should have done kind of feeling. And just say, you know, it's the fault of the person who did it. It's not my fault. And I'm gonna let go of that shame and come out publicly and get the support that's out there for me. There still is a lot of blowback in terms of victim blaming, but I think the fact that the silence is being broken at a much higher level than it ever has before, people are wondering about the pushback against Me Too and when is it all gonna, you know, implode or whatever. I do think we've crossed a bridge that we can't go back on. And even if the cultural conversation doesn't proceed in a way that is progressive and, you know, kind of culture changing, I still think we're not going to go back to the place where most people felt like they couldn't tell their stories. I think that piece at least has shifted permanently. And what we're finding is more and more people taking many different approaches to the problem of sexual harassment, abuse, and assault. So our approach is one, which is, well, two actually, training the witnesses to step up and training the people who are targeted, assertiveness and boundary setting on behalf of themselves. There are a million other things that need to be done, including changing the definition of masculinity and how men and boys are raised, changing the law, changing policy, changing behaviors in schools. I mean, you know, there are dozens and dozens of them. We do our one piece. I see a lot more people putting attention to doing their pieces wherever they are, whether it's in a bar, whether it's in a school, whether it's in city government, whether it's, you know, in a mom's group. So all of those things are going to be happening, and I do think we'll be moving forward.
I want to tell a quick story from my own experience, so that we can put a little humanity against this conversation. I ran a very high-end restaurant in San Mateo, California. It's a long time ago now. But I had a young woman who worked for me, an attractive young woman. Whether that's the case or not, it's not relevant, but she was just an 18-year-old kid, good soul, you know, nice human being. And she was serving a group of men at an event, and just doing her job. And I really wasn't even aware of her working in that moment per se. When somebody said, her name was Angie, when somebody said, Angie is really upset. And I'm, how so? She wouldn't come to me. And so one of her peers, this is the bystander conversation I think that you alluded to, and I'll get to a place where we'll be able to have a nice conversation about this. So one of her peers said to me, she's having a problem. You need to address it. That kind of response from a peer wakes me up as a manager. And I approach her and I ask her what happened. And she at first doesn't want to tell me. She almost feels confronted. And I understood that in the moment, because she doesn't want to deal with this and certainly is embarrassed and uncomfortable. Who, you know, how's she going to, I'm a 40-year-old man. She's an 18-year-old girl. It's the man who actually assaulted her, as I get to the full story, was in his 50s or 60s. I'm more his peer than I am hers. So I just, in that moment, could see all her trepidation loaded up. And I finally convinced her that I was on her side. You know, I'm here to protect and defend you. You're my focus. Nothing bad's going to happen to you, but I need to know what happened so I can address it fully. She told me the story. The man did something hideous. He literally touched her. And I won't get into the graphics of it, but the point is he touched her and completely inappropriately. So I approached the man and I pulled him aside and I asked him just to give him the opportunity to explain himself. Not that I really cared, but just as a process. And he said, the most horrible thing he could have said, of course, she knew what she was doing. I don't even know what that means. I think he thought it meant something significant, and I knew it was nonsense. And I said, great, you've made it very clear I don't have to worry about this conversation anymore by what you just said. Here's your check. It's time for you to leave. And I got him out of the restaurant and I separated him from the restaurant. And I don't know if I handled it right. I'm not even sure if there was a right way to handle it, because it's just an ugly moment. But I wanted everybody on my team to know that that wasn't tolerable and that nobody could do that to one of our team and feel that they were welcome in our restaurant. So it kind of leads to this conversation about how do we identify the vulnerable employee, somebody who is having a problem, so that they don't have to have a peer. How do we become the advocates, managers? What do we have to do? It was amazing that the young woman who approached me to protect her teammate did so, but what if she hadn't? I might have been unaware of it, not because I didn't care, but because I have 500 things to do. Right. So I'm going to ask you some other questions in that same vein, because I really believe our operators want to fix the problems, but we need to give them the tools to identify them and how to address them. So if you can kind of take my allegory as a story and do something to help us better manage how we behave, that'd be awesome.
Right. So I do want to say that I'm so sorry that your staff member went through that, and I hope she's doing better now. I think the thing that you said about I'm here to protect and defend you is a really good start. And just before I go into some of the details, we need to acknowledge that we're talking about harassment that goes every direction. So it could be a patron harassing a staff member. It could be a staff member harassing a patron, God forbid. It could be a staff member harassing a staff member, or a patron harassing a patron. So it can be in any direction. And if you are a person who witnesses this, or sees signs of it, you do want to step up. So I want to talk about this in two ways. One is, let's talk about the in the moment things, like what you did. You stepped up and let her know you have her back. This kind of behavior is not going to be tolerated in this establishment. In our trainings, we do spend a lot of time on how you identify when something is not going well. And I actually believe that since people who work in bars and restaurants work in hospitality, you are already really good at reading facial expression and body language, right? You know how you can tell without walking across the room if someone's not enjoying their dinner or somebody's not enjoying their drink, right? So you're using those same skills to tell if there's an interpersonal issue. And I hate to even call it that, because what it really is an expression of oppression. So we do work on what does it look like when an interaction is consensual, and what does it look like when it's not. So for example, sorry, we're not in the same room where we could act this out, but like if we're walking somewhere together within the establishment, or if we're leaving together and we're both into it, we might be leaning into each other. Like if we had each other's arms around each other, we'd be leaning into each other. But you can also imagine, because you've all seen this, one person has their arms around the other, and the other one might even have their arms around the first person, but they're keeping as much distance as possible while they're doing that, right? You also know, and I've talked to lots and lots of people who work in bars and restaurants doing this training, and everybody knows, has a term for this. You also know when someone is not looking at the person that they're interacting with, but they're looking past them and kind of looking around the room. I've had people I've worked with in different bars call that help me eyes, right? Or zombie eyes. Those are the words people are using for it. You can't trust the lower half of the face, because often someone who is being targeted will smile at the aggressor to try and placate them. But you can trust the eyes. If they're into it, they will be looking directly at the person. If they're not into it, they will probably be looking around or down or something like that. So those are just two of the things that we work with in a workshop that can help you see something that might need to be checked on. And it doesn't even mean you have to go over there and say you have to leave, right? It could be simply saying to both people, how's your meal? How's your evening? And getting a sense of how they're doing by how they respond. You also, at that point, let the person who's aggressing know that you're keeping an eye. And you also let the person who's the target know that you're there if they need you. So it can be a very simple thing. We're not talking about coming in with anything confrontational.
I want to highlight two things you said. The first one I think is extremely important, and we always are so focused on our staff because we work through the 25 or 30 people who are on our team. So your redirection to say it's truly omnidirectional. It doesn't matter who the player is in the narrative. It can be staff to staff, bartender could be coming on to a woman who's not interested or a man who's not interested. That's a really important point. It creates a more of a global understanding of the issue. And I think your secondary point about checking in, it's such a simple way to break a moment that you think might be dangerous for somebody. With your own staff, it's easy to pull somebody aside. Are you doing okay? Is everything happening all right for you? But when you have guest to guest, as you described, or even guest to employee, it's pretty simple to just crack the moment. And I really think those 2 points are very, very well made. One of the things.
So let me go back and address another piece of your question. So first I want to say, breaking the energy of that moment is a super simple and super effective thing to do. And it can be anyway. It can be, how's your meal? But it can also be, for example, if you're at a bar that doesn't have a lot of meals, but a lot of people standing around, it simply could be like, did you watch the game tonight? Or, oh, I love that band that's on your t-shirt, right? And even if it gives 5-10 seconds to break the energy, it may change what's happening. I want to address the other part of your question about how do we help our people be safe and protected. And the other thing is stuff that you do that's before the moment when something is going wrong, okay? And that is, first of all, sitting down at a staff meeting, and I know not everybody takes time for a staff meeting, but it's worth it to do it for this, if nothing else. Sit down at a staff meeting and give people a chance to talk about this. Because one thing that we find, as I think I said earlier, is that people have these skills. A lot of people have these skills, maybe not in every establishment, but in a lot of them, people have these skills. We go into bars and restaurants, we say, what are you already doing with these situations? We hear a million great techniques, creative, effective, smart techniques. But of course, nobody's, if you have 3 techniques you use, and I have 2 techniques I use as people who work in this bar, we've never sat down and talked about it.
Together we have 5.
Together we have 5, right?
Yeah, I get it.
If we're having a meeting of 15 staffers, think of how many we have.
Yes,
One of the things that our trainings do is we actually allow time for essentially a skill swap, right? Because you know your establishment, you know the culture of your establishment, you know the problematic patrons, you know the problematic employees, right? And how are people already dealing with it? So that's one thing. And so just sit down and talk about it. The other part that's super important about the sitting down and talking about it is making it really clear what you did with that employee that night. My employees come first, right? And you need to be safe at your job. And you basically, you do what you need to do and we will back you. In one of our first trainings with Safe Bars, we had an owner in the training, and it was actually an ownership team, 2 people. And one of them said toward the end of the training, when we had talked about like every possible thing, said, look, I want you to know you do what you need to do and we will back you. We will never punish you, even if it means, we lost a customer or something, because we can't have a place where this happens. So it's good to have that. It's good to put it in writing and have a conversation when you do the skill swap on what do people need in order to feel like they are actually backed up. Do they need just this blanket statement? Do they need some more? Do they need to ask you more questions about what you mean by that? Do they need some policies? Do they need to ask you a bunch of what ifs? If this happens, you'll really back me up? And we at Safe Bars are drafting a template policy that will be free, that owners and managers can adopt and adapt, adopt and adapt. And so it will have in it a lot of the kinds of things you'll want to consider having in your establishment. Every place is different. We know that. So, you know, you'll be able to do whatever you need to do with it, but it'll give you a good boilerplate foundation to start from.
That's great. We're going to publish this video blog on our website and whatever resources you want. I want to say to anybody who's, all the folks who are listening today, there'll be links to Lauren's organization. And if you feel like you could use the help that Lauren's team can provide, you're going to have access to it. So don't worry about remembering anything. We'll email everybody who participates, as well as do a general blog post around this. My next question for you is kind of interesting. So, of course, the subordinated relationship I want to talk about servers specifically, because I think, generally speaking, bartenders and servers are our most vulnerable, maybe hosts as well, are our most vulnerable employees. Certainly, people in the kitchen can have vulnerability, and I'm not trying to dismiss it. But I'm going to speak like maybe a less informed manager for a moment to try to tease out good answers for people who are listening. I run a place. It's a bar. It's a sexually charged environment. Right. We're encouraging it. The girls wear brief outfits. It's a part of the game. Mm-hmm. Now, we all, I think, given the context of the conversation, know that's a pretty Byzantine approach to it, and we can do better. Mm-hmm. But there is a reality to nightclubs and bar-centric joints that really do sell sex. I don't mean to minimize the values of anybody in that, but I'd like to hear how you can help folks who can't understand the distinction between safe play and unsafe play, mm-hmm. how they manage it. Because they've got to change, I think, their own thinking before you can create the environment. So I'm interested in what your experience and how you think that can be addressed.
Right. So none of our programs or organizations or trainers, we all have a very sex positive approach. That's important. We're not all about the restrictions. We have one giant restriction, which is consent. Okay? Consent is sexy. You don't want to get in a game where you're trying to catch somebody who's essentially prey who doesn't want to be in it, right? That's just it's not okay. That's a bright line. It is not okay. You may play the chase, something like that. You may have a venue that is very much about the sexually charged atmosphere, and you can do all of that with consent. So that's one of the things that you can have in that conversation that I'm talking about, or in the policy, which is like basically almost anything goes as long as there's consent.
Yeah, I've always had a philosophy about my body, my rules, which I think speaks to the consent concept.
Exactly.
And it's interesting. My fear of that is really more about the way guests respond. Mm-hmm. Listen, violence has a gender.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't make me proud as a man to have to say that out loud, but it's the truth. And violence comes in a lot of different forms. I think that's the lesson you're trying to convey. It doesn't have to be, somebody physically touching you for it to be a violent experience or to be oppressive. Those concepts all make a lot of sense to me.
Yes.
My biggest fear is, how do we communicate to our guests? Because, of course, this is the age-old story. You hear a man will respond, well, she dressed like that, or she was coquettish, or whatever his rationalization for crossing the bright line you just described.
Right.
And how do we, at an atmospheric level, maintain, we might not be able to answer this question, by the way. It's more esoteric than I probably should be getting. But ultimately, I think if we use and I agree, by the way, consent is sexy. If somebody wants to be with you, that should be the happiest moment you have in your life. So I think this is a really complicated part of the harassment conversation. Mm-hmm. Because, these young folks, men and women, are working to earn money. This is the problem with the tip relationship.
Yes.
It's a huge issue in our industry. And I guess maybe I'll ask you, and it took me a second to get there, but we're there. Let's talk about that and what we as operators can do to disabuse our guests of the notion that because they are paying a gratuity, it entitles them to something above and beyond their drink being served on time and correctly.
Right. And cheerfully.
And cheerfully. Yes.
So I'm going to give you a two-part answer.
Please.
They're very connected to each other. Before we get into the tips, which do play a huge role, I want to talk about the culture of a place. So you're asking, how can we make that clear to our patrons? You and everybody listening or watching knows the difference between a place where it's not so safe for women, where there's a lot of unwanted pickup attempts. In D.C., where I live, the Washington City paper unfortunately named a local bar as best bar for hitting on women or something like that. Okay, so you know the difference between that place and the place around the corner where people have fun, but it's not a problem. So I think everybody can look into what they know about the industry, which is certainly more than I know about the industry, and say, well, what makes the difference between here and there? And research shows that people who work in venue can make a difference in the culture. So I think by starting at the top, as we talked about, making a policy, having a discussion, having a meeting, doing a skill swap, that you begin to let that infiltrate how your staff are behaving, which will then allow them to affect how the patrons are behaving. And you set a limit with 1 or 2 or 3 patrons, and people will know it. I mean, people in the public, right? Because if you don't set a limit with those people and an incident happens, everybody knows it. Everybody knows it, and you lose business, right? The woman it happened to and her 3 friends are not coming back, and they're also telling all their friends on social media, and you're losing business. On the other hand, if something bad happens and you throw out the person who was doing the aggression or something like that, they tell their friends, like, this terrible thing happened, but the bar took care of it. So I think, I think just by taking the actions, large and small, you begin to create the reputation of whether you're a place that's comfortable for women, mostly women, to go to, but really for everybody. Once it's comfortable for women, it's pretty comfortable for everybody. Or whether it's...
I want to reiterate what you said a little bit. I want to re-speak it just because I think you answered the question more succinctly than I had hoped, which is great. In the end, it really is about leadership and the way an organization runs. What you tolerate, you will get. And so you wouldn't let people steal if you can avoid it. If you're running a joint where people stealing, you're probably also running a joint where people are getting harassed because you're not focused. So if you're not a good leader, you're probably not going to run a great restaurant, irrespective of whether it's about harassment or other elements of security or whatever. So that's who's listening today. That's who's watching us today. They're the leaders in the restaurants. So I think that point is crystal clear. How you present your approach is how it will pervade down to the smallest person in your organization. So
right. And I just want to say something about that. There is the patron interaction in the front of the house that brings in a whole nother possibility of sources of harassment, and especially around tips. Sure. But let's not minimize what goes on in the back of the house. Because there's a total culture of harassment in the back of the house.
Sure.
And I mean, not in every restaurant, but, historically, there's a super hierarchical inheritance. And there's this, the hierarchy allows people to be a kind of despotic who run the kitchens, right?
Well, Your point's incredibly important, because the problem inside of kitchens is I can find another server. I've got 12 or 15, but my lead guy on saute on Saturday night,
Right.
I could literally have my restaurant crumble. So,
right. So
great point.
There's the history that lets the chefs be. I mean, I totally think we should respect all chefs. I just don't think that they get to be little tyrants.
Nope.
But there's a history that encourages that and encourages kind of militaristic behavior of like barking orders and stuff like that. And a lot of people see that as necessary to the running of an efficient kitchen. I don't think so. I think being decent to other human beings, maybe even being kind to other human beings, does not take any longer. And in fact, it's more effective, because then you start working together. And so people are filling in the holes for each other much more likely.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And it speaks to what I said earlier. The same is true of leadership in a kitchen. And so if the chef is prickly, then his entire team's going to feel like they have license to be prickly. If the chef sets a tone where everybody is respected in the kitchen and they have systems, what you're talking about is the reality of a kitchen. They're high pressure places. One of the reasons I love the restaurant industry and I love working in kitchens is because I played college football. I love the structure and the team play where we're under pressure. Get that, fire this, do that. I get all that. But that can be done in a way that doesn't demean or destroy the dignity of anybody, no matter, it can be a dishwasher. So this gets into a deeper conversation about the way we treat each other as human beings. And this is less the classic understanding of harassment than it is more biases based on that hierarchy you've described. And by the way, I've seen women who are in kitchens as lead folks who are just as awful as men are. And I think this is an extremely important point, is we've got to change the culture of pressure in these kitchens to make it be a place where we're aspiring, not regressively attacking the people who are just doing their job. And if a staff person makes a mistake, that's where the ownership or the manager's job is to step in and say, hey, chef, direct that at me. I don't want you talking to them. If that's the way you're going to speak to them, I don't want you speaking to them, and be that leadership. So great point about the kitchen. And
I want to say there's a couple of things at play here, right? So we're talking about the historical culture of the kitchen with all its pressure and its hierarchy and stuff like that. And we're talking about oppression, which is what allows harassment, particularly of women and LGBTQ people. And so the combination of those happening in a kitchen is a double whammy. But as you said, anybody can be a harasser, anybody can be an aggressor. In general, though, men commit the vast majority of sexual violence, whether the target is man or a woman or any other gender. And women and LGBTQ people are primarily the targets. So then you add in that overlay of kitchen hierarchy and kitchen pressure, and they get, they have double authority to abuse people.
Well, it amplifies it, which is the problem. I completely understand. And I didn't mean to, add women into the gender issue when I described a woman. I was more talking about it's so ingrained in kitchen behavior that I've seen that happen. That doesn't mean to sort of dilute this conversation in any way. We're coming sort of to the end, and I'm very sort of so many different things are coming through my mind in this. Let's sort of try to do a little finish up and have you give some point by point or some sort of, let's do this. Give us one thing that somebody who is listening right now can do to markedly change. One step, this is going to make a difference. Let's get it done.
Okay. The vast majority of violence against women and LGBTQ people is by people that we know. And what I find going into bars, clubs, and restaurants is that staff are pretty well aware of the creeper, of the pickup artist, of the problematic guy who comes in every Saturday night, et cetera, et cetera. but they're not paying attention to the people who come in together. So you want to look beyond just the creeper and look at the couples who came in together, the people in friendship groups, the people who are just two friends together. That is, I'm going to say, people walk away with tons of different skills from our trainings, but that is the biggest thing that they are surprised about is, oh, I've been forgetting to look at people who are together. And I can't tell you how many times in a training someone will say, well, they seemed like they were together, so I didn't say anything, right?
Great point. We published a blog last year about a bar that did a note to women who came in, anybody on a Tinder date. If you're having a rough time, stop by the bar and say kitten or something and let us know that you're in trouble. And we're gonna if Tinder date gone wrong. But the point I think leads to what you're talking about is the bar was aware that folks coming in are just as vulnerable as folks that they're responsible for every day, so to speak.
So I would say, if you walk away, I'm going to give you two things to walk away with.
That'd be great.
One is start it as a practice to widen your focus to people who came in together, not just couples, but people in friendship groups. Whether that means posting something in the bathroom, posting somewhere where the staff sees it so that you remember it every day, or putting someone in charge of reminding the staff every day, something like that, because you can think about it once and then never think about it again. You need to make a practice so that it's an ingrained part of how you look at your floor. And the other thing is to have that first conversation with your staff where you assure them that you have their back and that you ask them what else that they need and you have a skill swap.
I got to tell you, Lauren, I've learned an awful lot today, and I'm really grateful for the time you spent with us. And what I'll likely do is, after we finish, we'll write another blog taking out all the really sort of straightforward opportunities and insights that came from this. It'll accompany the video blog, and we'll add the resources from Defend Yourself and Safe Bars. And when you have that policy done, we'll publish that to all of our subscribers as an opportunity for them to embrace it and to make it a part of their culture and their restaurants. I think it's great. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we finish up?
Yeah, I feel like maybe people need to know a little bit about what a Safe Bars training looks like.
That would be great.
Okay, so this is a super shortened version, but just so you know, we talk about sexual violence, harassment, abuse, and assault, and how they happen so that people understand the pieces when they're seeing it. We talk about bystander intervention and how it works. We talk about the relationship between alcohol and sexual assault, which everybody in the industry knows is not causal, but a lot of people out in the world think, oh, well, you know, he was drinking, he didn't know what he was doing, or she was drinking, why did she drink so much? We talk about the relationship with the way alcohol plays a role, but does not cause sexual assault. And then we talk about how do you notice it? So those things I was talking about briefly with you. How do you look at people's eyes and body language, face and body language? And then we lay out a framework for bystander intervention for using different strategies with either the person who is aggressing or the person who's being targeted. And then we just practice them all over and over.
It's interesting. I don't think anybody in the industry would argue with the responsibility they have to safely serve alcohol, and they do training for it and they require their teams do it. Is this really any different? You have a responsibility.
It's very similar.
It fits under the same security blanket and makes a lot of sense. Lauren, we are so grateful you joined us. This was as better than I expected. So thank you. And we'll continue to stay in touch with you and keep our readers informed as to what you guys are working on.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew.
Cheers. Have a great night.
You too.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. And next month, we're going to come back and we'll be talking about suggestive selling. A little less salacious conversation, but certainly important nonetheless. Have a great night, everybody. Thanks again for joining us on RailTALK.